about what else we might want to do to Istio. So that's all I wanted to say. I think Scott's the one who's going to talk about it.
Although it sounds like it'll be a limited audience.
There's at least one more that wants to see the YouTube video, so.
Okay. All right, guys. I just need to figure out how to share anything here. Share screen. Yeah.
There you go.
That should do it. All right. First of all, this is all open source, so invite you to come take a look at what I've done, make suggestions, improvements, whatever you want. So the basic idea here is that we want to provide Apogee management, API management services into the Istio mesh, and we already have a platform for obviously performing those services using like a proxy type scenario, and what we're trying to do is then provide a way of taking all that configuration that people have already done and allowing them to install it locally in Istio, and for it to just kind of magically work as much as possible. To that end, we've started with the basics of what we do with API management, and that is to provide authentication, authorization, some analytics capabilities, and quota. So let me just show you what it looks like on the Apogee side when you set these things up. Hopefully everybody can see this all right.
Yeah.
So what we have here is what we call a product, an API product. And I just created a Hello World product. So yeah, I should point out that you do need an Apogee account to actually make this work, but you can sign up for one. It's quite easy. So what we have here is when you create a product, you are creating an API that is going to be used in whatever way you want to use it. Basically, it's associated with an application and a developer, and I'll show you that in just a second. But I guess the easiest way to describe it is the product is actually where outside of very specific proxy policies that you can write that work in line in Apogee, in the full Apogee thing. This is where you would set the basics of who has access to what and what the quotas are. So some very basic policy information here. And what you'll see here is that I have a Hello World product. You see that I have created a quota for it, that we have 5 requests every minute. I don't have any scopes. You can set OAuth scopes if you want, and then you can use those when you generate your tokens. I have a path, a resource path, and what this is like a matcher. And if I slash matches anything in our world, but I can specify like very specific paths that would match. So slash hello world or slash test or things like that. The only thing that I've done different here than I would do for Istio that we wouldn't normally do in Apogee is I have an attribute which is it's a key value of Istio-services, and I tell it actually the value of the service that I want to bind this policy to. And so when my adapter downloads this information, it knows, okay, the way it matches is it says, okay, give me what service we're going to, the target service, and that's in this list, and it is a list. You can comma delimit it, and then it also checks the paths and make sure that the path is okay. So you can set up a range of things, and the scope. So all of these things have to match for this product to take effect on that request. And so you can set you know, multiple products in different ways for this kind of thing. The developer is not very interesting. It's just the, you know, user ID. But the app is a little bit interesting in that when you bind a product into an app, it gives you a key and secret that you can then use as either your API key access or use to generate a JOT token and then be able to access through that. So that's basically it from the Apogee side. So let me jump down into what I've done actually here. Can you see this okay, or do you still see? Okay.
That looks good.
Okay, let me hide that thumbnail. Okay, so what you can see here, I just set up, I'm actually running on Docker, Docker for Mac. And what you see here is just that I've done the install of Istio, and in fact, it's Istio 0.8 RC2, or however it's labeled. And I have also installed Hello World. So should be able to do just a quick see Hello World, and you can access both instances. So now what I'm going to do is go ahead and install the Apogee stuff. And there's basically three things, and I'll really quickly run you through that. You see there's definitions, a handler, and a rule. The definitions, really quick, it just sets up the adapter itself. It sets up a template for my analytics. And some basic configuration stuff saying that I'm going to match, and that I'll accept, you know, X API key as a request header. Otherwise, I'll also accept request API key if you've installed the API support. And I have a special rule here that normally won't be necessary, but it's to block out using the header, which this security Istio auth user info header is actually coming from the proxy for the JOT support. Eventually it'll be an attribute, but right now Mixer doesn't support that attribute. Oops, let me go back here. The other thing was, what did I say? Oh, the handler itself, it's very simple. Basically, it's just the config setup that you set up, you know, where you're accessing it, your org and environment, and your key and secret. And the key and secret comes from when you actually do your install on Apogee. And then finally, a rule which just says if I'm not going to ingress, I want to run this rule everywhere. And that can be obviously tweaked to whichever services you would like to run by label or however else you would like to. And then there's two instances that we call, one is for authorization and also includes quota, and the other for analytics. The authorization is on the check side, analytics on the report side. Okay, so at this point, I can no longer access Hello. I get a permission denied, missing authentication. So what I need to do now to get that to work is provide, for example, an API key, which I may actually have to, nope, that may not. I did install everything, right? Two rules. Yeah. Oh, it's possible it's not picking up the API key from the environment variable. It is not. Okay, well, let me show you where I got that key. It's right here.
We can just change that after this goes on YouTube.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. That's how it'll work. Okay, so now I have an API, and it proves for a second that it went farther.
Token is not valid.
Token is not valid yet. Interesting. That is fantastic. I've never seen that one. Somehow the expiration or the token availability, it's probably a timestamp issue, honestly. Oddly, between the server. Okay, let's assume for a moment that this works, because it does, and I'll have to look into that earlier or later. There's obviously some sort of token issue there. So let's just go to the token support. This is authentication policy. Let me show you. Here. This is the new Istio authentication policy that you can set up, and you set up your information to how to verify your JOT tokens and the targets. And I'm saying it's a hello world target. So I'm going to go ahead and apply that. Now at this point, what you'll see is you'll get an origin authentication failed, because it's actually coming from the pilot or from the proxy, and you'll get it whether you specify an API key or not. So at this point, what we need to do is actually get, oh, I don't know if that's gonna work either. Let me see. No, I need the secret. API, oops. Secret. So I'm gonna get a token, a JOT token, and I'm gonna include that in the bearer as a bearer token. And now we see we do have access again. Okay. API key notwithstanding. And then the only other thing that you'd notice here is if I keep trying this, what's going to happen is I'm going to exhaust my quota, get a 429 too many requests, and quota exceeded. And all that happened without any special configuration in Istio. It was all driven by pulling that information down from Apogee. All right, so that is the demo.
How do you see the policies between the two kind of coordinating?
I'm sorry?
Well, yeah, I mean, right now, there's a little of both, right? The Istio policy is defining high-level things that have to happen, and one of those high-level things that has to happen is, verify things using Apogee. And then in this particular case, there's a series of things we can do in Apogee. And I think that's sort of an open question going forward with Istio, which is, at what point does Istio configuration drop off and let a third-party system control things? It's not clear to me that there's a really obvious answer yet.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, this tends to be all driven by Apogee as opposed to the operator. But obviously, there's going to be some sort of handoff somewhere in there as to what can the operator do on the client side as opposed to what's all configured on the server side.
Yeah.
I mean, one good example actually is a quota, because I've opted now to not implement the Istio quota as the mechanism for the way Apogee works. Apogee is going to be working as part of the authentication and authorization. By doing that, I can completely control it from the server side without having to reconfigure Istio and its knowledge of our quotas.
Right. And the reason why that's interesting is because you want to give different quotas to different consumers of APIs, and possibly even different end users.
Right, right.
Yeah, the challenge we have with that though now is that to do this means there's no caching at the proxy anymore for check calls.
And we'd very much like to have that work.
Yeah.
Right. But it has to be extremely dynamic we have to be able to evaluate a lot of different attributes, as it were, in different ways to be able to get that to work.
So I know over time you've had a lot of issues with things missing and things not working out correctly. Given where you are now, do you see big gaps in what we're providing in the platform that made your job more difficult or impossible?
Well, from the functionality that I'm exposing right now, as we already mentioned, the quota is probably the biggest one. There are still some outstanding bugs, like the request auth claims attribute is not being passed through for some reason from the proxy. The biggest next thing is going to be that I'm going to want to move away from having a specially compiled mixer to having a standalone adapter. And I know that's coming soon. But after that, I guess the biggest thing going forward from that point, another thing, and you know about this as well, and that is the inability to encrypt configuration and secure it.
Yeah, so that's a big missing feature that we have at this point.
Right. And then from a feature aspect, at some point we're going to want to actually be able to affect the request, right? So whether it's adding, removing headers, or transforming the body, we're going to want some mechanism to be able to do that.
You were in the discussion this morning on the mixer stuff, right? The working group.
I was on for a while.
Okay, so we talked about that particular thing for a good half hour, 45 minutes almost. So we're definitely thinking about it.
Yeah, I mean, as we've discussed a bunch of times, there's different levels, right? Fully transforming the request and response is one thing, but being able to add or remove a header is, probably everyone is going to need that. Verify the OAuth token, take it off, and stick on a job. It's going to be a super common use case, right?
Okay, so given this audience, it's worth asking the question. So in addition to editing request headers and perhaps setting the target address for for final routing, what else would be useful for the mixer to do in this context? Arbitrary, is there other metadata that we want to control, or because that's all we've got so far?
So I have a clarification question. So the request, you put APG in the middle via the mixer, or you were routing through Envoy to APG?
No, right now what we have is in the mixer. It's a mixer adapter.
Okay.
So everything that I showed you there was through mixer.
Right. So we're not using Apogee as a proxy. We're using Apogee as essentially a policy engine, where we're doing the guts of API management, which is tell me if this consumer is authorized to use the API and by how much. Other things that get lumped under API management, like transforming requests and responses, are really API gateway stuff, and we've had a bunch of meetings about that, but that's not what we're trying to solve. This particular solution. However, did we get to being able to customize the error response as well? So that instead of returning a generic Istio error, you can return a particular.
Yeah, so that's one thing that came up this morning. Is there's an open issue on this, and I think it's just been sitting there for a long time, and it's my fault. I need to go look at this. So we're unclear. It's another big discussion we had this morning. It's unclear what errors mixer should. So right now, adapters can produce errors, arbitrarily complicated messages. Should mixer return that to the proxy? Should the proxy return that to the callers? Where should that get filtered? It's not clear what the right thing is in terms of PII, for example. So
well, there's another thing that doesn't even have to do with errors precisely, and that is with response codes and messages. For example, I can return a response code or with a message from my adapter, right? And I can be as specific as I want. But if I use the authorization policy where the JOT token is rejected by the proxy, I can't affect what that error is. In fact, like right now, it's actually pretty confusing. You only get one error. It doesn't matter what's wrong. You will always get a what was that I showed you? It was called I think it just said origin error or something like that. And it doesn't tell you anything about why it's wrong. It doesn't tell you that the JOT is expired or that you don't have one or anything else. It's just origin error. So that's probably something we should address. But I can't affect that from the policy at all.
Correct. So that's what you're describing sounds like a bug in the proxy. Right?
Well, the bug being that it only returns one error, but the fact that I can't actually configure that at all might possibly be a feature that could be considered as well.
Right. I mean, generally, people who are exposing APIs, I found they don't want any kind of generic error message. Among other things, the generic error message tells you what kind of software you just got the error from, which can be very handy information. So no matter what generic error message we come up with, arguably, API providers aren't going to want it. They're going to want to be able to specify the response code and the message that comes back for just about anything. We have this problem at Apogee where there are certain generic Apogee errors which are scary. And I'm sure other people.
So you're saying even the errors that are generated by the proxy proper
should probably be customizable. Yeah.
Mm.
I mean, even if it's a minor way, maybe Scott doesn't completely agree, but I mean, I guess basic stuff like not found, okay. But definitely, right. if it makes it to the adapter, you definitely want to customize that.
Well, you can in the adapter.
Okay.
Your responses from the adapter are
okay.
passed back to the client. But what's happening at the proxy level is it's not. You have no control over that, and you don't have control whether it's programmatically or in the configuration. There's just no control.
The response, I thought the responses from the adapters are stripped by the mixer client in the proxy. So
no.
Okay. Oh no, that's right. That's what the bug was about. The bug is asking this should be filtered because this is leaking implementation details and PII potentially and
stuff. So I think there should be two paths, right? One path is I'm returning an actual error from the adapter, and that I believe that should probably be filtered and not returned. But if I'm returning a response with a code and a message, I would expect that message to make its way to the client.
Okay, so a valid response that just happens to say denied.
Right.
You want to say why it was denied.
Right.
Okay, that's reasonable. Okay, I'll file an issue. So we have an issue on the mixer side. I don't think there's any issues like this for the proxy. So I'll open one for that. All right. Anything else on anybody's mind? Otherwise, we'll call it a day.
So, have you thought about doing the same check, but as a proxy instead? The same rate limit, right? So you put the Apogee as in between your services, and counting and routing to the next service call.
Yeah, I mean, we can do that already. I mean, we can put a tier of Apogee proxies in front of the ingress for your Kubernetes cluster. So, there's nothing new there.
So, but that would be outside the cluster, right?
Right.
Right. I'm saying in the same way that you did the rate limit inside the cluster. You could have done it as a proxy. That way you just forward the call.
Sure, but then we're adding another hop to Envoy is already an excellent proxy, and I like the mixer architecture because, well, if we can get caching working again, there's sort of an efficient way to handle a lot of common cases that we can plug right into, that's already part of the service fabric, and it allows us to put essentially policies anywhere in the Istio service mesh without having to deploy anything else. So, it's sort of, it's a nice model for the parts of API management that are these policy-like things, like verifying API keys and OAuth tokens and, quotas and things. It's obviously, for the part of API management that's, turn my mainframe into an API, we still need a proxy. And that's why we've had lots of conversations about, how that would plug into the Istio mesh.
So you were already going to to the mixer, so you could do additional checks. That's
Yeah.
your view.
Yeah, I mean, once we're in the Istio mixer, someone who has 10,000 services running in a giant mesh can simply say, all the ones that have the attribute external API are subject to the API management policy. And it's just a very nice way to sort of add these kinds of policies to the mesh without requiring a lot of configuration at the system level. Once you've got the mixer and Apogee in there, everything can be done through Istio configuration in a very scalable way. So, I think that's a nice complement to what we already support, which is deploy a proxy, right? So, that's sort of what we're, and Istio is it's still early days for Istio, so we're learning what customers really want.
Right.
But it seems to me this whole microservices problem is something that Istio really helps us with that hasn't been easy to address before.
Yeah, I mean, it should be possible if we wanted to, that we could write a Envoy plugin and deliver that to Envoy to do our quota stuff. But it's not, the checks that we do aren't trivial enough, I guess, to be able to do it based on the attributes that are and rules that are currently exposed through Istio.
Yeah, and I mean, keeping Envoy as something that has a fairly simple job to do and can do it very efficiently and reliably, I think that's going to be really important to making Istio meshes that are fast and reliable.
Right.
Even doing stuff like JOT verification and, protobuf to JSON transformation. I'm not super excited about doing that in Envoy. I understand that it can be done and it has been done. But, one could argue that, Envoy should deal with load balancing and HTTP and TLS and nothing else. And everything else is potentially an unreliable thing that could break at any moment. And we have to be prepared to have circuit breakers on it, all right? But, the jury's out on that one.
Yeah, so the Istio's extension model is through mixer adapters primarily. So that's kind of what we want to explore and what we're building machinery around to improve caching, allow offline operation for extended periods, and that kind of stuff. If you call out directly from Envoy, you have to reinvent some of that machinery, like the caching infrastructure, for example. It's a non-trivial thing to do a cache that deals with quotas, for example.
Yeah.
So I have a question if there's a free moment.
Yes.
So one problem we're facing right now from an API management perspective is how to control the information that one might proxy from an API gateway. So let's say you send some identity information that you want to use Pilot to create a route policy, but you ultimately don't want to send that information to everybody, right? Is there a way to control the propagation of information, or is that a requirement that has come up before? And it could be done via HTTP header, so it might be something like, hey, let this header propagate 2 hops at a maximum, or don't send this header to service A, only send it to service B.
Yeah, we don't currently have that kind of facility with the ability to do So we want to add the ability for Mixer to be able to mutate headers as they pass through the system. It should be possible to write an adapter that does this kind of editing. As far as making it stateful, kind of keep for 2 hops,
Yeah.
I'm not sure how to do that.
Right.
It sounds like the kind of thing you could do in a mixer adapter, but you know, check it and check the hop count and make sure the person who set the hop count isn't the bad guy, and then increment the hop count by 1. You know, who knows?
Yeah, yeah.
You have to have a jot on, you know, on who put the hop count there in the first place. But you know, the mixer adapter is theoretically a place where you can put these kinds of mesh-wide policies in place. That's why we're experimenting with using it with Apogee.
Interesting.
It ends up being pretty heavyweight, though, to do this kind of stuff, right? Because arbitrary proxies can talk to arbitrary mixers, which means to share state between mixers, you need to write to disks or to store it somehow. So you need a lot of infrastructure to support that.
Yeah. And when the JOT token gets validated, is it actually removed from the flow at that point, or does it continue to propagate?
I think it continues to propagate at this point.
Yeah, because the other problem too, I guess you would have, is if your mesh gets big enough, all of a sudden you're starting to build up a lot of extra propagation state.
Well, keep in mind, that's why it's important that a mixer adapter be able to change the HTTP headers.
Absolutely.
So in Scott's example, he could verify the JOT and take it off. Yeah. And you know, third of all, Istio off is a very nice part of the Istio mesh that gives you a TLS-based cryptographic identity on every service-to-service integration. And I think that's one of the main reasons people are using Istio. So, you know, JOTs are cool and we can do a lot with them, but some of the use cases JOTs are used for in a lot of microservices environments may not be necessary if you're using Istio off.
Yeah, the JOTs are useful for stuff coming from the ingress, primarily. Right? Interesting. Okay.
Thanks, guys.
All right. Anything else?
So can I ask in general about this group? Sorry, Martin, I don't want to preempt you, but we've struggled a little bit to come up with you know, entertaining topics for every 2 weeks. And you know, Martin is working really hard on Istio 1.0. You know, Scott and I are working hard on other stuff. We don't necessarily have, like, Google doesn't necessarily have a new spec to share every two or 4 weeks. So the question is, what does the rest of the folks in this community want to talk about in this SIG? Is it productive to do this every 2 weeks? Should we do it less often? You know, should we come back when we have something to propose?
Yeah, because my inclination was to propose to kind of effectively suspend this group for another few months until we started actually having engineers working on Istio's API enhancing Istio's API management functionality specifically. Since nobody's doing this right now, we're kind of idling.
Well, I can say for myself, I have been following up all these meetings in the Mixer meetings. I think there is some convergence on that. Yeah. And most of the features we have been discussing, I think the one that was most interesting was the mediation discussion. And I think we evolved on that topic. But I don't know, depending on the agenda what we have, maybe it could be on-demand approach, because I see we are struggling to keep agenda on that. Yeah, I agree on that.
Okay. Well, from my perspective, I'm just getting started. I don't know if you guys know me, but I work for IBM. I know Caesar here pretty well, and Jim. So I would certainly attend meetings for the next couple of weeks. I have a lot to learn, so I'm more in that kind of mindset right now, but I also have some concrete things that I want to try. So I certainly would appreciate some follow-up meetings.
Okay, well, let's keep the meetings going, and we'll be agenda-driven. So if you want to throw topics on the agenda, we'll discuss them. And like I said, I think after 1.0 ships in a few months, after that, we'll start investing in real human beings at writing specs and adding functionality, and then this is going to become more interactive and interesting overall.
And if you do want to have a topic, please bring it up in the mailing list.
Yeah.
Don't assume that Martin's going to entertain us every 2 weeks. So.
I can juggle. All right, that's it for today then. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
See you guys later.
Bye.